A24's newest horror film has hit theaters all across America this weekend, but is it worth your time? Let's find out. Writer, director, and producer Ty West has returned with his newest horror film, and as a genre filmmaker, West has really proven himself to be a pretty versatile voice in horror. Since The House of the Devil, which sort of put him on the horror map, so to speak, back in 2009, West has played within multiple different subgenres within horror. You have the paranormal sensibilities of The Innkeepers, stories of the occult with House of the Devil and The Sacrament, the found footage angle of VHS, and now West has found himself in the slasher subgenre following a group of young filmmakers who take a trip to a secluded farmhouse in rural Texas in 1979. Unbeknownst to the owners of the farmhouse, however, the budding filmmakers are there to make an adult film and are hoping to break into the film industry. And once day turns to night, things start to take a pretty sinister turn, we'll say. Something I've really admired about West as a director is his ability to capture a certain era so well on film. Aside from maybe Anna Biller's The Love Witch, I think West's The House of the Devil really is probably the best example of a film that has come out that takes place in a specific era in the past, but also totally succeeds in making you feel like you are also watching a movie that could have come out in the era that it takes place in. And it seems like West is interested in a similar idea here. As I said, the film takes place in Texas in 1979, so there is this Texas Chainsaw Massacre sort of grime and grit to the film, but West has also said how he was inspired by this specific sense of Americana that can be found in movies like Two Lane Blacktop and Smokey and the Bandit, of all things, which is something actually kind of evident when watching this movie, is West's fixation with Americana and the sense of the American dream. If some of the characters' dialogue wasn't enough to tip you off to this idea, the film's use of this font, which is very much Robert Altman's Nashville, should probably do the same thing and just kind of let you in on what this movie is about to discuss here. The film makes a point to bring up the American dream and this road to success these people are trying to find, as well as how this headed for the big city attitude sort of clashes with the more middle America kind of sensibilities that you would find in rural Texas, which was such a surprising perspective that this movie had, and one that actually was one of my favorite elements of this film, is this conversation that the movie is having about these generational differences and the values and ideologies that can clash out of that. I won't get into it too much because I want you guys to have the same experience of surprise that I did, especially in regards to certain character motivations in this movie. But this film takes this really unique approach that you would expect to find in a movie like this. And I say that meaning when you watch a movie like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or really any of its sequels, there is this point brought up consistently about this conflict that arises when city folk start putting their noses where they don't belong. So I was expecting sort of that to be the case with this movie, which it is to a degree, but this film mostly is talking about this fear that can come with getting older and how that can amalgamate to form this sort of animosity or resentment to a younger generation who are able to do these things, that want to have this sense of possibility and ambition ahead of them. It really is such a unique perspective and conflict that this film has, and it really is a standout point in this movie. But lest we forget, this is a slasher film first and foremost, which is why I am also so glad to report that another element of this film that is really first rate are the kills and gore in this movie. This thing is downright grisly at times. I think most, if not all, of the kills and effects in this movie are done practically. There may be a couple of blood splatters comped in here and there, but from what I can tell, most, if not all, of the kills in this movie are done in camera, which I cannot emphasize enough how glad I was to see that be the case. Because if West is attempting to make a movie that is trying to capture that sense of 1970s horror, the quickest and most surefire way to completely remove any sort of atmosphere or aesthetic that this film would have to achieve that would be to add a ton of digital effects. So I'm so glad that they made this a priority in the film, to have these in-camera practical effects. And it absolutely pays off because every kill in this film looks fantastic. With that being said, though, there is another element in this movie in regards to its special effects that doesn't quite work as well, and that is in regards to some old age makeup that this film has. I suppose it is a bit of a spoiler, so I won't get too far into it, but I will say there are characters in this movie that are obviously in some makeup to increase their age and make them look significantly older. 2 characters to be exact. One character I thought looked terrific, and the other, not as much. And I think the choice to do this is more of a thematically important one as well as a practical one. The latter I can't really get into because that's kind of in regards to something that happens after the credits in this movie, so stay tuned for the end of that if you want to know what I'm talking about. But thematically, I can get into that because it does go into what I was talking about earlier about that generational divide. And I think thematically, I understand this choice and I do think it's a pretty interesting idea. However, I did find this character and the look of them to be pretty distracting. One of the characters in this makeup is portrayed by someone who is in their mid-60s. So the transformation to get them to look like they're in their, let's say, 80s is not that much of a drastic change. The other character, however, is portrayed by someone who is in their late 20s. So getting them to look like they're in their 80s is much more of a challenge. I think the makeup effects team did as good of a job as you could really ask for, but I thought this decision from a ground level and an inception level was not a great idea. I don't think it's as seamless as maybe they would have liked it to be, and in all honesty, I found it to be pretty distracting. Which is really a shame because a lot of the scenes that this character is in, it's really supposed to be the more horror-centric scenes or the scarier scenes in the movie. And unfortunately, some of those scenes just didn't quite affect me on that level because I was sort of distracted by this makeup. This character is supposed to be pretty gross and creepy, but I just wasn't able to fully buy into that, which I think is actually a pretty consistent problem that this film has, and that's in regards to this movie and the scares that it tries to offer. Because more oftentimes than not, I found a lot of the attempts at horror in this movie to be pretty unmoving. And I think that's because of a couple of reasons. For one, there are way too many jump scares in this movie. To be fair, not all of them, in fact, most of them are not false jump scares, which is good, which is better. But still, a lot of the setup and payoff that these films have in regards to its scares are pretty similar. It's just a pretty loud noise that happens and is supposed to surprise the audience. And I've got to be honest, I would have preferred to see a bit more creativity that this film could display in regards to its horror. Because when this movie is not just berating the audience with jump scares, I didn't find a lot of the attempts at tension or this kind of eerie sense that this movie tries to capture. I didn't find it particularly effective either. Not for a lack of trying though, because this film does tote a pretty great score that tries to set the scene. So there is an attempt made here, but I just didn't really find myself ever being emotionally affected by this movie, apart from just having fun with some of the kills and some of the humor in this movie, like I discussed earlier, which I think really is the best way to describe this movie in a word, is just fun. And I was kind of hoping for a little bit more than that, especially because this film is actively having a conversation within the movie of how you can make something artful, even though you're playing in kind of trashy territory, which I think a lot of people would consider slasher films to be a part of. I personally don't. I love slasher films. And in that regard, this movie totally delivers. The kills are as brutal as you would expect them to be, and the characters are about as layered as you would also expect them to be. This film also completely nails the style and mood of films from this era. And aside from this pretty interesting perspective on this sort of envy and tension that can happen between generations, I don't think that this movie does really anything else excellently. This movie does a lot really well and is a ton of fun, but not quite enough to where I would say it's in the same echelon of A24's best horror movies. Which is precisely what I want to ask you guys today. Did you see X? Where does it rank in regards to A24's other horror films? I'd love to know. Make sure you leave your thoughts and opinions down below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching today. I hope you liked today's video. And if you did, you can click on the link down below so you can subscribe to my channel to see more movie reviews and movie related things. Again, guys, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.